What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you several video game franchises that I believe at least have been mismanaged and that I would like to see them get it together so we can of course enjoy what those franchises have to offer, though in the case of at least one of these I think that franchise is just straight up dead at this point, but we will get to that in a moment because as usual a couple qualifiers. Now I know this might surprise some people, but as a video games reviewer I do in fact have some opinions about video games, especially when it comes to various franchises and how they've been handled over the years. Though, I also think it's important to mention here at the beginning of this that when it comes to what I'm talking about here, it's not necessarily always about money. In fact, in at least one of these that we'll talk about, you could argue that they're very successful because they are making a lot of money. But I suppose then that comes down to how you choose to calculate what success is to you. For instance, to me, sacrificing your prominence in a genre or the market in exchange for a quick buck may very well net you a substantial amount of short-term gains, but is going to cost you in the long run, as an example. But I'm also not blind to the fact that, ultimately video games do have to make money. They have to be financially viable on some level for them to even get made in the first place. And so I wouldn't necessarily consider, things like underperforming sales as a sign of mismanagement. More that through a series of decisions, they've ultimately arrived at a point where they've taken a franchise down a path that I don't think is sustainable, or at least is going to have very negative connotations for its outlook looking forward. With all of that stuff said, however, I'd like to kick it off with something straightforward, if perhaps driving home one of those points about success that I mentioned, and for me, that is the Diablo franchise. Specifically in recent years that have seen the release of things like Diablo Immortal and the way Diablo 4 has handled its monetization as an example. Now, if you've watched the channel much, you may very well know that I'm a huge fan of the Diablo franchise. I have nothing but love for a lot of what it is in terms of lore and even just the story of it, which is strange given the genre of game that it is, but it's always something that has meant a lot to me, and I played it an unhealthy amount as a kid for sure, especially Diablo 2 in particular. Now, while Diablo 3 was not exactly what I wanted it to be, it wasn't such an egregiously bad decision as to, I think, have caused long-term damage to the franchise, but obviously opinions on that will differ. For me, however, where it really started to take a bit of a turn was Diablo Immortal into Diablo 4. Diablo Immortal is, as the internet likes to tell you, Diablo immoral. The monetization of that game is gross, and it's really the perfect example of sacrificing your credibility in return for short-term gains. I'm sure that Diablo Immortal has continued to rake in a ridiculous amount of money for Blizzard. Now, not to mince words, I think Diablo Immortal's monetization practices are disgusting, reprehensible, and quite frankly, extremely damaging to the brand. And that's before we even get to Diablo 4. Now, curiously enough, I actually enjoyed Diablo 4 when it launched quite a bit, and then it, steadily made changes to what I liked about it, and honestly kind of shifted it more in the direction of what Diablo 3 was, which, while clearly what was working for them, isn't something I was really too ecstatic about personally, even if gameplay-wise it wasn't much of an issue. But as was, I would say, kind of telegraphed by Diablo Immortal, Diablo 4 also has a lot of really gross microtransactions in the store for them, all sorts of skins that cost more than the game does, battle passes, and all this other nonsense that they attach to this game, and, at the same time making it always online in an effort to continue to extract as much cash as possible from everybody who plays it. And that is just such a far cry from what Diablo 2 was and did that it honestly kind of bums me out the direction the franchise ultimately went. From a groundbreaking experience to pay-to-win mechanics, a real sad decline for me to witness at the very least. But that does bring us to our second title, which is none other than World of Darkness. So the World of Darkness, one of my favorite franchises just in terms of lore and interactions and stuff, but the World of Darkness, if you didn't know, is kind of the larger net that encompasses things like Vampire the Masquerade, but there's a lot more to it. Stuff like Werewolf the Apocalypse, Mage the Ascension, that kind of thing. And the thing about World of Darkness is while they started off kind of strong with video games, with things like Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, and then Bloodlines, of course, it has had a real rocky time since. not least of which because of the various back and forth and some of their own financial problems, as will be a recurring theme here in a bit. It's a franchise that is ultimately, in terms of video games, kind of boiled down to two things. Really fantastic visual novel games, which honestly, while great from a story and narrative standpoint, just don't really, I would say, take full advantage of the medium of a video game the way that more traditional games do for me, and then kind of middling games that are more traditional video game experiences, like Vampire the Masquerade Swan Song, which was, alright at best. That Battle Royale, I think it was called Blood Hunt, that I don't know that anybody was looking for from this franchise as an example, and a bunch of other stuff that was kind of messed around with and never really came to fruition. And that's before you even start talking about all the nonsense that has been going on with Bloodlines 2, which is about to release next month. And while I hope that game is good, I think you can take pretty much one look at the development cycle of that, and it's pretty clear there was some mismanagement going on. And so this one is honestly just a much simpler case. I wish they would figure out what they want to do with this franchise and all of its subsequent parts, and start making the video games that I know would be really great. Though I do kind of feel like they might be trapped in a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy at this point, where they don't want to invest a ton into these games because historically they have not exactly sold especially well, but they also haven't exactly sold especially well because a lot of the games themselves are middling, and it's become a bit of a vicious cycle here. And it's the franchise that honestly is just in desperate need of an actual hit game to really, I would say, kind of kickstart it into what I would like it to be, but obviously that kind of thing is much easier to say than actually do and deliver upon, and as much as I want it to happen, I just don't think that's going to be Bloodlines 2 from everything I've seen so far. Though ironically, perhaps it is at least fitting for this particular entry that the world of darkness remains shrouded in darkness thanks to what is going on with all of these video games behind the scenes, as it seems there's some sort of curse preventing a masquerade violation perhaps. Next up though, we've got another easy one, and this one is actually fun because it's just so much nonsense over decades, and that is none other than Dungeons & Dragons. So the Dungeons & Dragons franchise has an incredibly long and interesting history, but in terms of video games, it's actually also pretty noteworthy because one thing you'll probably quickly notice, especially if you start playing a lot of D&D video games, is that there was a nonsense amount of them releasing in the 90s and early 2000s, and then it just kind of stopped. And this is something I've actually made a video on previously when we were anticipating the release of Baldur's Gate 3, which is obviously a big notable release for them, but even that is also kind of been mismanaged, at least in terms of capitalizing upon that success. But the reason there's kind of a dearth of D&D video games after a certain point is because there was a sort of legal battle over the rights to them and making them and publishing them, and that stuff didn't get fully sorted out until I think it was the mid-2010s if I'm not mistaken, and then obviously it takes a few years to actually start making video games, and that's why only in the last couple years have we actually started to see things fully start releasing. Like, of course, Baldur's Gate 3, but also even other stuff like that Dark Alliance reboot that kind of didn't go anywhere. And then, in much more recent news, as people are probably much more aware, Wizards of the Coast has made a whole host of, I would say, questionable decisions over the past couple years, everything from their OGL changes to how they've chosen to work with their partners that has seen Larian depart from, continuing to work with the IP, which means whoever is going to get tasked with making Baldur's Gate 4 is in a real rough position. Though, to be fair, you could have honestly said the same thing of 3. Simply put, those are just some of the reasons that we haven't seen a lot of D&D video games outside of a few, and while we have been eating pretty well, I would say, thanks to things like Baldur's Gate 3, even that game is really, I think, just a drop in the ocean of what is potentially viable from what D&D has to offer in terms of all its settings and opportunities to bring to life some truly special campaigns and stuff. But to be super frank about it, it just kind of looks like both Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast don't really seem to have what it takes to bring these things to fruition in the realm of video games with anything approaching consistency at the very least. But at least the old games are good, I suppose. Now that brings us to our fourth from the last entry, and this is none other than Fable. So Fable's an interesting one in the sense that this one actually has some hope for the future, at least because it is actively getting a reboot that is slated for now 2026. It was supposed to be 2025, but got pushed. I have a feeling, like this is just speculation on my part, but if you happen to remember, some of their initial showings got a lot of pushback in terms of like the characters and the humor and stuff. And I think in wanting this reboot to be a really big thing for them, they might have went back to the drawing board on some of that stuff, which may well be the cause for some of those delays. But again, that is just purely speculation on my part. But in terms of the actual franchise, it has been notoriously mismanaged up until this reboot, and we'll obviously have to see how the reboot goes and whether or not that's any good. But it's in that position where you have to worry about that kind of thing, because while the initial entry built up a lot of hype and was incredibly well received, and 2 was also pretty good as well, Fable 3 is where it really started to go downhill around 2011-2012. This is because, honestly, I think 3 stripped away a lot of what made the Fable series so great to begin with in the name of streamlining everything and making it easier, to the point where like you just straight up can't die in Fable 3. You get knocked out and lose some experience, but that's kind of it. But while the franchise was clearly kind of moving in a direction that I think was a departure from what fans wanted, at least in terms of Fable 1 and 2, what made that problem even worse is that they kept trying to spin it off into other things afterward, like Fable The Journey, Fable Legends, Fable card games even, and just like none of it was working, which ultimately led to the cancellation of Fable Legends and of course the closing of Lionhead Studios, as many people know nowadays. And while that's well and truly a shame, the reason I wish they would get it together, and I hope the reboot turns out especially well, is that for me at least, the first game in particular, and then parts of 2 for sure, really just had like this special thing that made them incredibly interesting to play, even if the franchise itself was never like this gigantic thing. But playing 1 especially for me, you just have so much potential in what they were working on there that to see it never get iterated upon and instead streamlined and stripped down for parts when you get to 3 was a real shame, and that franchise could have been so much more, and with any luck maybe it will be, but I'll believe it when I see it. Which does bring us to our final entry, and obviously the most controversial by far, because this is in fact the Dragon Age franchise. Now, as many people are aware, I've always kind of went against the grain on this one. Origins was never really my favorite of the Dragon Age series, and that's kind of funny given that I cover so many CRPGs and that's what I'm known for, and Origins is really the only CRPG in the bunch, and I didn't really care for it here. But what I've always loved about the Dragon Age series was the lore of it. In fact, I enjoyed the lore of these video games more than the games themselves, which I think is saying something. But it's also no secret that after the release of Veilguard and the subsequent reaction to that game, that franchise is basically dead. And I'm sure somewhere in the comments I'll get something about how I enjoyed Veilguard quite a bit, which is true, I did, I stand by that review, but how could I think it was mismanaged if I enjoyed it? Well, if you actually watched any of my other Dragon Age content besides the Veilguard review, you'd know that I also have another particular thought about the entire Dragon Age series, which is that all of those games lacked a proper identity. Every one of them was trying to be something else, and it's a series that as a result never really seemed to know what it wanted to be, which then created all these different factions within the audience that also wanted it to be different things, because that's what the game series kept trying to do. And then you add on top of that situation, developers and corporate executives that are trying to twist it even further into even more shapes that the fan base as a whole didn't even want, such as that live service model. In fact, one of the reasons they blamed the launch of Veilguard on was the lack of live service elements as an example, which was just nonsense. And all of that is before you even get started on the various interviews with, of course, people who worked on these games across decades even, that can tell you about all of the sort of workplace drama around resources and priorities and things that aren't of great interest to me in this channel, but are an interesting listen, if nothing else. Ultimately, that of course brought us to today, however, where again, the Dragon Age series is pretty much dead in the water. I wouldn't expect to see anything at all from this for maybe another 20 years when they might try to reboot it when somebody's feeling nostalgic. But while part of me does absolutely wish that, we would have gotten more Dragon Age, because it is by far and away one of my favorite lore setups and worlds to explore. It was just so intricate and interesting in the way it handled everything with the blight, the fade, the demons, all that stuff. But at the same time, ultimately, I think this franchise being dead might kind of be for the best, given that, again, it was just being pulled in so many directions by so many people that I don't think it was ever going to stand up to that pressure for long. And if it wasn't Veilguard, it was gonna be something. Either way, though, there have been a few franchises that have been woefully mismanaged, which has, unfortunately, prevented us from getting glorious video games to play. But that is pretty much going to do it for today, so I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.